Good morning. Welcome to a Greenbuild event. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to make sure that everybody's arrived. Thank you. For those of you who've arrived, we're just going to wait another minute to ensure that everybody can get in. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to North Norfolk's Greenbuild. This morning's session is going to be held as part of our series of two-week Greenbuild events, which are designed to coincide with the United Nations Climate Change Conference currently being held in Glasgow, COP26, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The online Greenbuild event this year is set out to explore a wide range of climate change and environmental topics, with the hope of providing greater awareness of the issues that we all face, but also to inch that a little bit closer to the answers to sustainable, brighter, greener, and brighter future for us all. My name is Rob Young. I'm the Assistant Director for Sustainable Growth at North Norfolk District Council, and I'll be hosting today's event. My colleague Nigel will also be on hand to help with any digital aspects of hosting, such as assisting with the chat bar and live polls, which I'll come to in a minute. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're going to be recording the event today, and this is so that we can share it online afterwards, and we'll notify you when that's happening. So you're aware throughout the whole of the session, your cameras and microphones will be automatically muted and turned off. Despite this, there will be opportunities for you to interact with us, and we'll let you know how to do this. Just to check that you're all there, and to check that the technology is working, and that you can hear me, I'm going to pop a couple of questions up onto the screen, which we'd like you to answer. Please don't worry, your answers will be anonymous, so feel free to be honest, but this is really just a check to make sure that things are working. So on our introductory poll, the question is, what's the weather like where you are? It's lovely and sunny this morning, wild and blustery, pouring down, grey and cloudy, or something else. Okay. Interesting results. This possibly gives us an inkling into where people are logging in from, but it seems to be grey and cloudy. We're talking about the physical weather here, not your sort of mental mood, but grey and cloudy seems to have won the day, but it's lovely and sunny in lots of places. Thanks, Nigel. If we could have the next poll. So why are you here today? To find out about the Council's work and net zero target. I've heard of Net Zero East and want to find out more. I'm interested in the decarbonisation agenda. I'm not sure. Isn't this the Chris Packham talk? Well, nobody's chosen the last one, which is encouraging. And it's encouraging to see the bars changing. So the technology is definitely working, and you are there and can hopefully hear us. And it's also encouraging to know that the majority of people are there to find out about the council's work on NetZero. Great. Thanks, Nigel. So later on today, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters. You can do this by typing your question into the Q&A bar situated at the bottom of your screen on the control panel. You may send your questions at any time during the presentations, and we'll collect these to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. We'll not answer these before the Q&A session commences. When asking a question, can you please let us know who it is intended for? You can simply do this by typing the speaker's name before your question. Alternatively, if you leave no name, then we'll sort of decide which member of the panel may need to address it. If you wish to use the chat bar at any time during today's presentation, then you can do that. That can be viewed, the chat can be viewed by everyone, so we ask that you are respectful in your comments and mindful that Greenbuild is a family-friendly event taking place in the morning. My colleague Nigel will be on hand to field any quick clarifications and comments, so please feel free to use the chat function to communicate with him. To check that the chat bar is working, and if you want to, can you please type in your name and where you're dialing in from, just so that we can get a sort of a sense of where our audience is today. So if you just put your name and where you're from in the chat, that'd be great. Splendid. So, we've got someone from as far away as Leeds. Number of local participants, which is great to see. Splendid. Okay. If I or any of the presenters today have any IT issues or connection issues during the session, then please don't panic. We'll try and resolve them as quickly and as smoothly as possible. But please do bear with us. And if things get really catastrophic, then we can always reschedule the event, and we'll notify you of when that will take place. But I'm sure that won't be necessary. The IT seems to be working so far. We've allotted roughly 20 minutes for each of today's speakers, as well as some time for question and answer session at the end. We'll try and wrap up the event by midday. So to introduce our speakers today, we've got presentations from Annie Sommazzi and Michael Brown, and we'll be joined in the question and answer session by Councillor Nigel Lloyd. First of all, Annie, who was appointed by North Norfolk District Council almost a year ago as a Climate and Environmental Policy Manager. In that time, she's formulated and promoted the Council's Environmental Charter, reviewed the Council's carbon baseline data, developed and led on the carbon reduction strategy and action plan, and established novel ways of communicating environmental messaging, including this innovative programme of events as part of our virtual Greenbuild. Annie is someone about whom future hosts, I'm sure, will say needs no introduction. But okay, over to you, Annie. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob. That was a very nice introduction. And Nigel, if you don't mind just sharing the screen. Great, thank you. So I'm going to start this presentation today by looking at the climate emergency declaration that North Norfolk District Council made back in 2019. I'm then going to move through the steps and the processes that the Council's enabled so far, and then share some initial detail on our 2018-2019 carbon baseline figures, before then handing over to Michael from NetZero East. So next slide, please, Nigel. So in 2019, North Norfolk District Council declared a climate emergency. And in doing so, it recognised that the catastrophic impacts that human activities are having on the Earth's environment. As many of you will know, since then, over 300 councils in the UK have also declared climate emergencies. However, despite the declaration of the emergency, it remained unclear exactly what a climate emergency entailed. And then as part of that, crucially, what the role of local government was in driving forward change. There was and there still is no definitive advice on what local councils should do, but the information and resources available today are much better than they were back in 2019. And real advancements are being made by many councils to lower their emissions and attempt to reduce the impacts of climate change. So having reflected on the climate emergency and then looking at the nature and requirements of the North Norfolk area, an approach was chosen by the council here that sort of outlines 3 main phases of work. And I should say that these phases will be initially addressed in a chronological way, but there is of course crossover through each phase of work, and therefore we're not really limited to completing one phase before we move on to address the next. So phase 1, that looks at how the council is going to decarbonise its own estates and operations. This focuses not just on that net zero 2030 target, but how as an organisation we can begin to structure ourselves to respond to the climate emergency. So although it is brilliant having a dedicated climate change and environment team within a council, it kind of means nothing in isolation if our communication team or our human resource team or customer service team, for example, know nothing about or have no understanding of the climate agenda and the work we're going to undertake as a council to address the issues. And then on top of this phase of work also involves addressing procurement processes, governance structure, and decision making, all of which of course are key to responding to the climate emergency. And then that phase 2 area. So that looks at how we're going to lead the wider decarbonisation agenda across the district. And this will focus on how we address major emission sources and how we then go on to enable others to deliver the changes required to meet that 2050 net zero target. The council recognises really that in order to effectively lead this agenda, the first phase of our work is really key, because we need to be able to demonstrate how we as an organisation can address our own emissions before we then start to instruct others to follow suit. It's needless to say really, but of course this phase relies on a collaborative approach with a wide range of stakeholders which come, both from the public, the private and the third sector. And then finally, that last phase. This looks at how the council can empower others to make a difference in order to reduce their own carbon footprints. And so this involves engaging with residents, with community groups and businesses who may have not yet engaged with the climate and environmental agenda. And so events like Greenbuild are a great way of doing this and hopefully bring into focus the wide range of issues that come under that broader banner of environment. So next slide, please, Nigel. So in terms of the council's climate emergency journey so far, you can see where we are. I've counted some of our milestones, but not necessarily all of them. But we have set targets, i.e. net zero 2030, and then we've also defined these targets in terms of including our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in this, which I'll come on to later. We've begun to work with staff across the council to embed that whole council approach to the climate emergency. In May this year, we adopted our environmental charter, which effectively solidified the environmental agenda as a whole. In June this year, we established our 2018-2019 carbon footprint. And so we now have an understanding of a baseline from which to move forward that net zero agenda. And I'll touch on this later and go through some of the process that this exercise has taught us. And so we are currently developing our carbon reduction strategy and action plan, which we are working with NetZero East to deliver. This piece of work will effectively establish how we will achieve net zero by 2030. And this last month, of course, has seen the climate change and environment team working towards the setting up and running of this Greenbuild event, which today's session is obviously a part of, and will have hosted over 2 weeks, 15 speakers, over 500 attendees, and will have included a range of workshops and seminars, webinars and discussions. So next slide, please. So if we look at the council's environmental charter, an extract of which you can see on your screen on the left, some of you may be familiar with this, you'll see the pledges highlighted in yellow are the main areas of work where we're currently focusing our attention. So these include things like measuring our carbon baseline, working towards our net zero 2030 target, and then things that I've already touched on, like mobilising staff across the council through workshops and training courses. And so we now feel that we're in a position where we have started to set into motion the main part of phase 1 of our delivery on the climate emergency declaration. So that, that graphic that I spoke about in the first slide. Thanks, Nigel. Next slide, please. So in terms of detail, I'll go on to discuss the results of our indicative carbon baselining exercise in a minute before I then hand on to NetZero East, who can discuss in more detail the carbon reduction strategy and action plan, which we're currently developing. But before I do that, I just wanted to share a brief 3-minute video, which I think really nicely looks and demonstrates how organizations set environmental targets, but also it looks at what they mean when they adopt environmental targets. And I will then go on to explain a little bit more about our own route to net zero. So if you could share that, please, Nigel.
Companies have been making a lot of promises lately.
We're going to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero.
Unilever is committing to net zero emissions.
We can achieve a net zero emissions world.
But what does net zero actually mean? At the most basic, companies have been making a lot of promises lately.
We're going to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero.
Unilever is committing to net zero emissions.
We can achieve a net zero emissions world.
But what does net zero actually mean? At the most basic level, net zero means not putting any more carbon into the atmosphere than you're taking out. Climate scientists say the whole world needs to get there by 2050 if we want to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And the companies that make all of our stuff are a key part of that. So how can you tell if a net zero pledge has substance beyond the beautiful shots of wind turbines? Let's look at 2 hypothetical car companies with net zero plans to see the difference. This is the Falcon Car Company. Falcon plans to power all of its factories and its offices with renewable energy. There's still some sources of emissions from their factories that they aren't sure they can clean up, like the super hot furnaces they use to build car parts. To make up for that, the company says they'll pay to plant some trees. Sounds like a pretty solid plan, right? Well, this plan will only clean up about 5% of the carbon emissions tied to Falcon's business. It doesn't address the fact that their main product runs on fossil fuels. That brings us to the Sparrow Car Company. They also say they're going net zero, but they're looking at it in a completely different way. Just like Falcon, Sparrow is cleaning up all their direct emissions and buying clean energy. But Sparrow is also looking at indirect emissions, known as Scope 3 emissions. That includes the carbon footprint of the materials they use to make their cars, the cars themselves, and everything in between. Under this net zero plan, Sparrow will need to use more recycled materials, they'll need to produce more efficient vehicles, and eventually they'll stop producing gas-powered cars altogether. And they'll also pressure suppliers to cut their emissions too. Otherwise, they'll be forced to take their business elsewhere. This is the power of tackling Scope 3 emissions. One company's climate plan can ripple out across the whole economy. Still, it might not be possible for companies like Sparrow to eliminate all of their emissions by 2050. That means Sparrow will need to invest in ways to suck carbon back up and store it, so that no new carbon accumulates in the atmosphere. So the next time you see a company with a net zero plan, remember to read between the lines for these key details. Does their plan include all of their emissions? Will they actually cut emissions, or are they just planning to buy carbon offsets? Do they have near-term goals? We can't wait until 2049 to figure this out. And finally, can you trust their numbers? There are organizations that vet corporate climate plans and can tell you if they're legit. Like it or not, we need companies to go net zero. But if they say they'll do it, we've got to hold them accountable.
Nigel. So what exactly was it that we had measured when we carried out our carbon baseline audit? Well, basically the process involved identifying the activities within the council that are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions being released into the atmosphere. It sounds obvious, of course. Although there is no standard methodology in place at the moment, the most widely accepted approach, which obviously the video talked about, for measuring emissions is to identify and then categorize emission releasing activities into 3 main groups, as explained. So they are known as scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And that's obviously the approach that we then took. So as a council, our scope 1 emissions, which are generally referred to as direct emissions, are those activities owned or controlled by the organisation that directly release emissions straight into the atmosphere. So this is the emissions that are released from heating our own building or through business travel, for example. And then our scope 2 emissions are those emissions which are released into the atmosphere in association with our consumption of purchased electricity, heat or cooling. These are called indirect because they're emissions which literally occur or are released somewhere else, like at a power station, for example. And then finally, we measured our scope 3 emissions, and these are our indirect emissions, which are a consequence of our actions, but which occur from sources which we don't necessarily have direct or full control over, for example, waste disposal or purchase materials. So next slide, please, Nigel. So what is our 2018-2019 baseline carbon footprint? Well, when the council measured it for the period 2018 to 2019, the council was responsible for emitting approximately 6,633 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere. So when we then compare this to other councils across the UK, we kind of sit somewhere in the middle. Some councils, such as Charnwood Council in the Midlands, only emit 1,468 tonnes per annum. Others, Coventry Council, emit 16,333 tonnes, which is down from the 35,000 it was emitting in 2008 and 2009. And Lambeth Council, for example, has such large emissions that it measures them in kilotons. But really, I suppose the point is that regardless of what other councils are doing, our 2030 target is bold. It is ambitious, and it's not that far away. And then, as you can see on your screen, what does 6,633 tonnes look or feel like? Well, as you can see, it's the equivalent to all 300 members of staff at North Norfolk District Council taking 4 return flights to Sydney in a year. Next slide, please, Nigel. So finally, in this breakdown, you can see that approximately 95% of our emissions are our scope 3 emissions. So those are the emissions emanating primarily from our leased assets and our contracts, such as the waste contracts. So when you think back to the video that we looked at earlier on, it would really seem quite incomplete of us to target set net zero only for our scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is obviously why we've included scope 1, 2 and 3. So as I previously mentioned, we are now working closely with NetZero East to update our own emissions data, but also to look at how we measure and monitor emissions on an ongoing basis. This process will then lead to an action plan which will enable us to reach net zero by 2030. Along the way, we have encountered a range of difficulties, and our initial baseline, which was carried out by a different consultant, relied on applying benchmark data, i.e. what would a typical consumption be for an asset of X nature at X size, and we're trying to move away from this approach because really we need to have a very accurate picture of what our emissions look like, what the main sources are, so that we can then start to decarbonise. Next slide, please, Nigel. So we're not really interested in developing an action plan that provides or just considers a generic set of solutions. The hope is that through working with NetZero East, we can start to apply localized issues to achieve our target. We also want to explore how we deal with any of our residual emissions once we have that we have left once we've decarbonised our estates and operations. So dealing with a residual carbon emissions effectively means carbon offsetting, but rather than joining a carbon offsetting scheme through an accredited provider, we want to look at how we can offset any of our remaining carbon emissions locally, possibly through natural solutions such as tree planting, pond projects, coastal habitat, peatland, grassland or heathland restoration, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that provides an update of the work that the council has undertaken and the direction that we are starting to head in. And I'm now going to pass over to Michael, who is the lead analyst at NetZero East, who's going to explain a little bit more about the work that NetZero East are currently developing and how we're working with them to develop our own carbon reduction strategy and action plan. So over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Annie. If I just present my screen, hopefully that's visible and you can see that.
Yep.
Great. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as Annie says, I'm going to walk through really how we've been trying to support the council over the past few months. I'll go through what we're looking at doing in respect to developing a climate action plan, but also looking at how we're planning to work it so that we can enable wider decarbonisation across the district, and that the council's efforts don't just benefit the council's own operations, but also benefit the wider district as well as we move forwards. So firstly, who are we? Who's NetZero East? So we set up in 2021, so earlier this year. We were set up by Nigel and Jonathan Reynolds as the co-founders. But our main role really is to look at collaborating with local stakeholders and local councils in the east of England, and helping them to act on decarbonising their estate and their emissions, and accelerating that transition to net zero before 2050. So what we've found is that there are a number of tools out there to support local stakeholders, local businesses and local authorities in delivering net zero, but they often tend to be very generic and not very place specific. So I suppose our approach really is looking at how we can work with the local characteristics of the area and the local attributes of the area to make sure that decarbonisation is done in the most effective way possible, which is good for people and local businesses. On the bottom of there, just worth mentioning, we've been working with the council as well with our Hydrogen East project, which is looking at stimulating hydrogen development in the east of England. So looking at decarbonising transport, power, heat, those kind of things, so that we can see more real emissions reductions in the immediate term across the district. So just a brief overview on the national picture then. So many of you will know that we have this net zero target now as a nation by 2050. We know that many local authorities have declared climate emergencies, and they've committed to quite ambitious net zero target dates, and North Norfolk District Council's being 2030, so one of the more ambitious ones. The issue is, though, that there's not a whole lot of guidance currently from government, from top down, and so the expectations on local authorities are not clear. The funding to deliver decarbonisation at a local level isn't necessarily there at the moment, and also that leads to the fact then that there's insufficient resources. So, we need something from government that says, here is what we want you to do, and here is the commitment moving forward, so that local authorities can then begin to resource up and start to deliver on some of those issues at a local level. Just worth mentioning there on the right, that figure shows the carbon budgets to date. So what government has set out as required in terms of emissions reductions at a national level. And you can see there that from 2030, we're going to start to see big decreases in emissions. So getting ahead of the game and reducing emissions where we can now is where we need to be. So another little bit here on what the role of local authorities is. So we know that we've got these national targets, but what is the role of local authorities in delivering those targets at the local level? So the Climate Change Committee there has mentioned that local authorities can be the cornerstone of climate change partnerships across the country, and they can be linking delivery organisations with those that are required to decarbonise and make it possible to realise that decarbonisation at a local level. The figure on the right is probably most useful in setting out what the council can do in order to support decarbonisation. So you've got point A there. So where we're at the moment, what the council is focusing on is reducing its own emissions. So those emissions from its existing fleet, those emissions from its buildings and assets across the district. And then moving forwards, we can look at point B, which is around procurement and commissioning. So what can the council do in respect of choosing the best suppliers or building in environmental and net zero requirements into some of the contracts that they look to deliver. Point C around place shaping, so thinking about transport links, recharging infrastructure, cycling routes, the linkage between towns and villages, what the council can do to influence some of that and again enable a switch to lower emission transport. And point D there around showcasing, so sharing learnings as we go along. So it's all well and good making this reduction in emissions for the council, but it's about sharing that with the wider community and the wider businesses that will need to embark on a similar process in the near future. So sharing the good and bad of doing that and identifying some of the challenges will help hopefully other bodies to deliver similar results. Partnerships on there as well. So I suppose councils almost act as the glue between a range of local stakeholders. So you've got businesses, academics, public bodies and community users. The council can almost act as a facilitator between discussions between those bodies and again start to link people together and enable further decarbonisation. And then that final point there just on involving, engaging and communicating. So providing information on the challenge of net zero or consulting on local plans and just spreading further awareness on net zero in general really is something that the council is well placed to assist with. So yeah, so there's a range of things there that the council can be doing. I think there's some asks that we still have of government in respect of creating more clarity on the role that local authorities can play, enabling coordination between government bodies, and also making sure that the funding is less fragmented. So right now, councils will be given a pot of funding to apply for, and within very tight timescales, the council has to send a submission, an application to acquire that funding, which can be very constraining given all the other things that the council has to be delivering at the same time. So if we can get a more set funding pot moving forwards, then that will enable the council to properly tackle this issue and at scale as well. So if I just move on then onto the climate reduction strategy and action plan and what we see as the right structure for delivering a strategy. So firstly, what is it? So I think Annie touched on this earlier on, but the action plan for North Norfolk will be setting out the steps that the council is going to take to reach net zero emissions by 2030. And again, as Annie alluded to, there is no right way of doing this right now, and there's no set pathway, but we're looking at an approach which is transparent, readable and accessible and ideally exciting. So the transition to net zero should be a positive thing and should be something that we are all excited to be embarking on. And so delivering a climate action plan which delivers on all of those things is what we're aiming for. In terms of the specifics, so we'll have within there the existing carbon baseline. So Annie's presented to you the figures for 18-19. We'll have an updated set of figures for 19-20 and 2021 as well to bring us up to date. So to show how the emissions have changed over time and also what impact the pandemic had on those emissions and how high we expect those to rebound moving forwards as things start to get back to normal. We'll set out in there a project pipeline of actions in the short to medium term, but we'll also assess what impact those actions will have. So how much will those actions reduce emissions in reality, and where will we see those emissions reductions across the district. And then a key aspect, which we think is fundamental when we're looking at the council's own operations, is also thinking about what the council can be doing now to enable wider district decarbonisation. And I'll touch on some of the things later on that the council can look at in doing that. So just a little bit more on the structure. So what we're planning to do is set out specific actions and projects for 2022 to 2024. So things that the council can act on now to deliver near-time or real-time decarbonisation, but also more importantly, setting out that approach for the final years. So we need to know how much further we've got to go to reach that net zero target by 2030, but also what the council is thinking of doing or looking at doing to collaborate with the local community. So a key part of the action plan will be around governance. So looking at setting out who the key actors are, both within the council, so who's going to be delivering on this stuff, but also who we need to be talking with across the district to deliver on some of these things, but also including within there how we can start to report progress and give clear updates on where the council's got to and what the council needs to be doing, and make available some of those resources on the website, but also give an opportunity for stakeholders to feedback and make a point of what they would like to be seeing in the local area and what more we could potentially be doing to enable that. So in respect of where we've got to then, so we've done a lot of the carbon baselining work, so that began in 2020. We've been validating the footprint through to the most recent financial year, so through to March 2021, and we're looking in a good place with that now. We're going to integrate that into the action plan, which is where we're at the moment. So we've been setting out the approach for how we're going to deliver the climate action plan. And we're aiming for a final draft for review by January 2022, with the aim of hopefully getting council sign off by the end of the financial year, so in March 2022, which we can then share at that point. So I suppose the key message here is that this is all looking at setting out the process for delivering action in phase 1, so that the council's own emissions, but phase 2 can then begin, and we can start to look at how we might be able to enable that wider district decarbonisation. So we thought it would be useful just to give an overview of how we see the wider district fitting into what the council's looking at doing in respect of reducing its own emissions. And so firstly, we've brought out here a couple of trends across the district or across Norfolk and looking at what's going on elsewhere. So we can see on here the light blue line, so third from bottom, is North Norfolk District Council's total emissions from 2005 through to 2019. And we can see they're at around 5,700 kilotons a year. You can see that there is a big range across all of the districts in Norfolk, but North Norfolk's the third lowest emitter of all of those. But importantly, although we've seen a decline across those years from 2005 across all of the districts, it is quite a gradual decline and quite a slow decline. And if we continued at that rate through to 2050, we wouldn't be meeting those net zero targets, and we wouldn't be delivering on what we're saying we're going to do. So if we break down that slightly further, so this figure here shows the sectoral emissions for each of those local authorities. So we've got those total figures, but where are the emissions coming from and which areas within each district? So you can see from these bars that those light blue bars, again, are pretty prominent across all of the local authorities in Norfolk, and that's reflecting the rurality of the district. So those blue bars represent transport. And we know living in Norfolk that a lot of the areas are more rural than some of those built up areas. And so a lot of the emissions that we're seeing across the region are transport focused. And so that should be a priority area for the district as we move forward. An important note as well for North Norfolk is that transport emissions have actually increased since 2005. And again, that is just because of a dependency on the private car. And so looking at what the council can do to facilitate better transport links, better recharging infrastructure, linking up towns and villages will be an important aspect of anything that North Norfolk looks to deliver. And so another challenge I should pick up on there is the fact that domestic emissions as well in North Norfolk are quite high. So that's due to the fact that many of the houses are reliant on fossil fuels for heating. And again, we've got a map to show exactly the spread of that in just a moment. So really the message here is that although Norfolk and a lot of the local authorities within Norfolk are typically similar in respect to their rurality, there's huge differentiating factors across each of the districts that each council will need to focus on, and they'll be different for each region. So taking that place-based approach is what we see to be best. So looking at a couple of examples then across the district. So just showing here the domestic heating across North Norfolk. So that map there on the right is just showing you the percentage of households that aren't actually connected to the gas grid. So the darker the colour, the more households that aren't connected to the gas grid. So you can see large parts of the district, despite having the Bacton gas terminal, which is one of the largest gas terminals in the country, sending through about 20 to 30% of the UK's annual gas demand. A lot of the district doesn't actually have connection to that grid, and so are using other means of heating. So that's a positive in a sense that residents aren't locked into a system that's using natural gas currently, but it's also a barrier in that some of the other solutions that they're using tend to be oil. So if I just click forward, we can see the map here that shows oil heating across North Norfolk, and you can see those areas that aren't connected to the gas grid are actually instead using large quantities of oil as their main heating source instead. So there's challenges there for North Norfolk that other regions won't necessarily face. And so looking at what the council can do in order to help facilitate some of the discussions there and help to decarbonise heat is important and something that needs to be considered. The bottom point there as well, just to make reference to, is that a lot of these areas also have low EPC ratings. So firstly, looking at reducing, that the council could help in looking at reducing emissions from improving the energy efficiency of buildings across the district, to bring down the overall energy consumption, and then look at alternative fuels for heating across the region. Another slide here, just looking at the electricity infrastructure. So we can see the majority of the electricity infrastructure here is low voltage. So these thinner yellow lines across the map. That creates a barrier to both new generation coming online, but also for electrification of households and businesses in the future. So right now in North Norfolk, the electricity grid is very, very constrained. And so even if a developer wants to go ahead and site a new solar farm, or if a new housing developer wants to look at creating electric heated households that are zero carbon, it's not necessarily so easy in doing that because of the barriers presented by the existing infrastructure. So the local authority, North Norfolk District Council, can look at engaging with UKPN to present some of these issues, and look at what the solutions might be moving forwards. Another one here as well, just looking at the existing charging infrastructure. So we can see currently that charge points across the district are really around those major town centres. What the council is looking at doing in delivering its climate action plan is decarbonising its own fleet. And in doing that, there's an opportunity almost to look at where charging infrastructure could be beneficial to the local communities as well. So how the council can look at improving the infrastructure across the district, benefiting its own operations in terms of reducing emissions, but also benefiting reduction of emissions across wider transport users in the region. So Annie's already mentioned some of what NNDC is already doing, but I thought it would be useful just to reiterate. So We know that the council has declared a climate emergency, and it was the first to do that across Norfolk. We've got the environmental charter now, which is setting out a lot of the priorities that the council can begin to build on at this current point in time. And we also now have that net zero target by 2030, which the council is looking to meet. The council is looking at installing charging points, and we're starting to see that come into fruition across the district. For example, looking at where recharging leisure centres might be enabled. Council recently also put in a bid for the public sector decarbonisation scheme, so looking at acquiring government funding to make some of its existing building stock run on zero carbon heating solutions. So that's been submitted, and we're expecting to hear the results of that within the early parts of 2022. We've got the tree planting initiative, which is underway, and it's quite an ambitious target there again of 110,000 trees by 2023. We've got that commitment for single-use plastic to be single-use plastic free by 2023 also. And we're now at the point where we're working with staff to reduce the carbon footprint. So looking at work from home solutions, whether that's going to have a positive impact on reducing emissions, looking at active travel and facilitating commute to work of its employees by other low carbon means. The council has also been supporting decarbonisation at the gas terminal, at Bacton Gas Terminal, is looking at its potential to become a hydrogen hub in the future, which has the potential to be a low carbon green gas moving forwards. There's been some early discussions as well around looking at decarbonising some of those fossil fuel diesel lines across the region. So a lot of the lines across North Norfolk, or all of the lines across North Norfolk, are not electrified. And so those moving forwards might need to be looked at in terms of other options for making them low carbon. So there's work being done there in respect of looking at what the options are, and then also talking with some of the other regional bodies in terms of how it can spread the word in terms of what's being done and what more can be done. So there's lots of stuff that's been done to date, which I think is the key message, but what we're looking to do with the climate action plan is bring all of this together and create a coherent structure moving forward so that it's clear what the council is aiming to deliver year on year, in addition to providing a progress update to check whether the council has been able to deliver on that. And I suppose just the final point really is just to look at some of the other initiatives that are being done by other local authorities across the country that North Norfolk might look to implement. So there was a 1 million community municipal bond launched by West Berkshire Council in summer 2020. And that took on investment from 600 investors, and there were around 20 to 25% of investors in the local area. And what that was looking at doing was giving local residents and other investors an opportunity to invest in some of the schemes that the council wanted to implement under its environmental strategy. And so by giving locals a share in that transition, but also by enabling the council to make that transition, looks like quite a positive step from the outside anyway. And some of the measures that it looked to implement was solar, LED lighting, and some cycling routes across the district as well. So something there that the council might be able to look at. Greater Manchester, they did a similar thing with their environment fund, so looking at carbon and habitat banking. There was a fair bit of funding acquired there to do that, and the council looked instead at taking a partnership approach, so working with the Wildlife Trust, some of the other local authorities in the region, and Finance Earth to deliver some of that decarbonisation. Dorset, I thought this was another good one that we could potentially look at doing something similar across the district. So this basically set out actions within its climate action plan to develop zero carbon building standards, looked at how new developments might conserve biodiversity, how the council might be able to look at planting woodland, and also installing some of that electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And some of this the council is already doing and looking at, but something that could form a greater part moving forwards also. And then also some of the schemes that are being done by London local authorities, but also Cornwall and Nottingham in terms of delivering retrofit across buildings. So creating a demand for retrofit establishes a supply chain in the local area, which can then be used for wider decarbonisation across other operations and other businesses in the district moving forwards. And so NNDC might want to take a similar approach moving forwards also. So just in summary then, just to say that NNDC has been really working on moving forward the decarbonisation of its own estate. But really the next key step, which has to be at the forefront of all of the thinking, is around how the council can do some place shaping and look at some of that wider district decarbonisation. So those knock-on effects, some of those key aims are going to be getting supply chains going, providing some local value where possible, but also proving that decarbonisation in North Norfolk, which is largely rural, proving that decarbonisation is possible and is actually viable at that local level. And so taking that place-based approach, so one size doesn't fit all, each area, even within North Norfolk, is going to be different. Taking that place-based approach should enable effective decarbonisation, which takes into account some of those key characteristics, so some of those barriers and some of those enablers across the region. So hopefully that was useful, just in terms of giving an overview of where we've got to in respect of setting out the council's action plan, but also looking ahead to what some of the main barriers are going to be across the region in terms of decarbonisation, and what the council can look at doing in facilitating that, but also collaborating in delivering that moving forward. So yeah, hopefully that's useful. I think if I hand back over to you now, Rob, to lead some Q&A.
That's perfect. Thanks, Michael. So we've had a number of questions coming in, and I'll pose these to the panel. And while that discussion is taking place, if anybody's got any further questions that sort of those bring to mind, then please feel free to carry on adding them to the chat or to the Q&A bar. So the first question is one, I think I'll pose it to you, Michael, but I'd be interested to hear the other panelists' views as well, including Councillor Nigel Lloyd, who I hope is there. So the first question is, what is the single most important thing that councils can do in order to assist with the national net zero aims? So obviously councils have a variety of roles and influences, but they are only councils. What's the most important thing that councils can do to achieve the national goal?
Yeah, so I suppose, in terms of a fundamental first step, looking at reducing its own emissions is important, and should be done, and that should be the initial first step. But I don't think that's probably the biggest role the council can play. That's just about leading by example and showing what can be done. The council is in a unique position whereby at the local level, it is the glue between all of those other bodies and those businesses and residents across the region. And I suppose what the council should be looking at doing is sharing its best practice, and also sharing more on what's being done already across the region and what can be done. And really just information sharing, getting the conversation going, and speaking with local people. So actually physically engaging with local people, I think, is the best way to move some of the debate forwards, and where the council is quite best placed actually to assist with.
Yeah, so I guess, yes, our own emissions on the sort of grand scheme of things are not huge, but we could have a much broader influence on people whose emissions are far greater, I guess, certainly in numbers. So any responses from either Annie or Nigel on that? Annie?
Yeah, I would just say, I totally agree with what Michael said. I suppose one of the other things that I'd add to that is that so that councils can move those conversations forward and so that it can sort of lead on the decarbonisation agenda, the first thing that we need to do is to start to embed a kind of a culture of climate emergency within our own organisations, and I think that's massively important and challenging, and so I think obviously that's part of the work that we're trying to do, is to work with staff across the council to kind of embed understanding and knowledge of what that emergency means. And I think that's vital, because actually, as I said, often teams like my team, you know, there's 3 or 4 people in the maximum, and actually we're in a strong position that we've got a dedicated team at North Norfolk District Council. So really to enable that kind of proliferation, I can't say the word, but you know what I'm trying to say, throughout the district, to sort of to set that kind of those ripples into motion, it's got to be a whole council approach. So yeah, I think that would probably be my answer.
Thanks, Annie. And Nigel, Lloyd, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with that, but can you sort of point to one single thing that you think you know, the council is doing or needs to do?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I think Annie's really hit the nail on the head. I think the culture change that was required, if I go back to 2019, when we first declared an emergency, first thing that came to mind as a problem for me was the fact that we hadn't trained our staff. The staff really didn't know how to deal with climate change. This was a new, these are people that deliver services across the district, and now we're asking them to consider climate change just about in every decision that they make. It's a bit like stopping a super tanker, to be honest, but no, we're getting there, and we now have a large number of staff that are really actively supporting what we're doing here. And for me, it starts at home, like it does for everybody, really. We can all do our bits, but I mean, you know, if we're to be exemplars, which is what I want us to be at NNDC in regard to climate change, then we have to get our own house in order. And I think we're on that journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that leads us seamlessly to the next question, actually, which is a bit more specific about the council's net zero goal. So I'll pose it to you then, Nigel, while you're on. How difficult will it be for the council to achieve its net zero goal?
I wouldn't underestimate the difficulties that we're facing. I think in the early years, the next few years, we'll be choosing what I would call low-hanging fruit. The easy, you know, for example, we have a large portfolio of car parks. There's no reason why we couldn't install solar over those. The constraints, of course, as has been pointed out by Michael, are that the electricity system in rural North Norfolk can't always take that quantity of electricity. So there are other challenges. So we have to find often we have to find a user for that electricity. But those sort of projects, you know, solar on roofs, you know, we'll do all those. The last 30% down to zero is going to be the most challenging, in my view. And I suspect when we get up to the 2029s, we'll be looking at some offsetting measures. But until we get the report from Net Carbon East, we won't know that for sure. Well, that's my feeling.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, it's by no means going to be easy, but there are things that we have within our gift. So the question then to Michael then perhaps, which is you know, on the same question, but in a broader sense, how difficult will it be for councils, plural, to pick up this agenda, you know, following the discussions at COP26? What do you think will be the role of councils, and how well equipped do you think they will be in sort of tackling that agenda?
Yeah, well, obviously, you know, you've already been through yourself the fact that, you know, councils do play a key role at the local level in delivering net zero, and all of the things we've discussed today outline some of that. I think the biggest challenge for you as a council at the moment is around getting that support from a national level in terms of, you know, what is your specific role and what can be provided to you in order to deliver that. I think there are lots of things that you guys can already be moving on, which is some of the stuff we touched on today. So looking at how you can already start to reduce your own emissions, looking at how you can start to influence the way the local area works in terms of what's available to other users to decarbonize also. a lot of that stuff you can look at doing, but really what you're going to need moving forwards is some guidance from a top-down level. But moving where we can now, I think, is a good place to be. And I think as soon as we've got this strategy up and running, you'll be able to make proper action on the ground and start to deliver on what you're saying you're going to deliver. So when we're in that position, I think that'll be very good.
Yeah, okay. Slightly different question, which is about our sort of global response to climate change. And it's an open question, I think, to all of the panel, but what do you think will be the answer? Okay, this is a big one. Technological innovation, conservation and reduced consumption, or behavior change? I guess you're going to say it's all of the above, but in which case can you put them in order? So, you know, is there a technological fix? There's a lot of discussion about that at the moment. Should we, you know, change our lifestyles and reduce consumption? And, you know, to what extent do we need to compromise what we're doing and change our behaviour? Or can we carry on as we are? I don't know who wants to pick that one up. Actually, we've got Nigel Cornwall from NetZero East on the call with us as well. Maybe Nigel, perhaps you'd want to kick off in response to that one. And you've had you know, a lot of dealings on the technological side of things, certainly with the taking forward the hydrogen agenda. So would you like to come back on that one first of all? Thanks.
Yeah, I think just making a wider observation, there is a huge amount of focus on technology A over technology B, and central government, in my opinion, gets rather distracted by that. And one of the unintended consequences of that approach is that it deflects interest and understanding of things that can be done today. So technology, demand side, behavioural response all have a very important role to play. And I'm deliberately not going to give them a ranking. What I will say is that the approach that we've been supporting NNDC develop is one based around what we see on the ground and the local circumstances. Michael showed some of his excellent maps, and you know, we feel that we've developed I'm not going to say an intuitive understanding, but a much better understanding of where NNDC fits, what the mechanisms might be for it. And the hard bit now will be translating that into tangible, specific actions in the next 2 years. Fully agree with Nigel. It's the, you know, you've got to get going. You've got to get somewhere down the trajectory. We will not develop a clear menu of all the things that need to be done. That's an iterative process, and we need to make sure that, you know, the arrangements that the council has in place allow it to push forward and then continue to learn. And as technology, as demand side understanding, as people's behaviours become more focused, we can then be in a position to push things further forward faster. As Councillor Nigel Lloyd mentioned, you know, net zero by 2030 is a very easy thing to say, but it is a huge, huge undertaking. And we will have to be very creative and resourceful in coming up with specific strategies that work most effectively and at least overall cost for the region. But I think based on the work that we've observed, certainly over the last 6 months, you know, we are in a much better place. And we now need to take that forward and begin to engage around some of this thinking to make sure that there is wider ownership and acceptance of the need to move this forward as a matter of absolute priority.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. So do any of the other panelists want to come back on that, maybe from a personal perspective? Annie, you've got a view on, are you going to dare to rank those three things?
Yeah, go on then, I'll rank them. I think that for me, it is around the behavioural change, and I've kind of already mentioned that before. But we know that humans have got this amazing ability to innovate. You know, I think in some of the other talks that we've had over Greenbuild, people have talked about, you know, the speed with which a vaccine for COVID-19 was enabled. So we know that humans can innovate. You know, a lot of the technology is there, and it will be developed, but really it's that we need the will to invest in those technologies. We need the will to want to see those changes. And I'm not just talking about, you know, councils or Norfolk or, you know, even the UK. I'm talking about globally. We need to have the will to make those changes, because it's not outside of our ability as humankind can do this, but we need to really want to do it. And I suppose part of that, and you know, I won't go into this in too much depth, is that it's about addressing all of the other barriers that stop this being an important issue. So, you know, all of the other inequality issues that stop this agenda being as high as it should. And so for me, that is the number one. That is the number one issue. The technology is there, humans can innovate, but we need to really want to do it. So yeah, that would be my answer. So yeah, I've ranked them.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if Nigel, Lloyd, did you have any? Did you want to step into the fray there and proffer an opinion, or, you know, they're all important, but what do you think we collectively should be doing most?
All of the above is the answer that I'd give you. So I think it's quite difficult to rank them. You know, before Annie came on, I'd already written down behavioural change. I think mankind has the amazing ability to solve its own problems. And, you know, there is a track record in this, because the Montreal Protocol that led to, you know, eliminating CFCs, or largely eliminating them, which allowed the ozone hole to start recovering, is a good example. It had to come to a crisis because people were talking about that 20 years before. And my biggest worry about climate change at the moment is, are enough people seeing the consequences to really galvanize action into this problem? It's very slow, it's very incremental, it seems. Yeah, so Chris Packham was on the other night, and he was saying everybody should be doing that little bit, all of us, and don't ever think that your little portion of contribution towards eliminating climate change is insignificant. It isn't. And I think slightly different message from the question posed, but that would be my answer, that we should all be doing whatever we can.
Thank you. Yeah, and things won't change if we carry on doing things the same way repeatedly. Yeah. So we've got there's a couple of questions which I'll join together, which is about declarations of climate emergencies amongst local councils. So there's a suggestion that Aylsham Town Council has just declared a climate emergency at its first meeting of interested people, which is great to see. And other councils, parish councils, town councils and district councils are doing the same. But how can we persuade other Norfolk councils to join what this council is doing? And, you know, what's the incentive for them to do that? And there's a supplementary question about how much does this cost? And that's a difficult one. So, you know, what the resources that North Norfolk District Council has put to this. I mean, I can provide a part answer to that, I think. But you know, so making the commitment or making the declaration is one thing. How can we persuade more councils to make those declarations, and what level of resource do you think is needed to turn those declarations into action? So I'll start with you, if I may, Nigel. Lloyd.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Firstly, I'd congratulate Aylsham for declaring a climate emergency. Well done for doing that. The follow-on question from Margaret Hayward about influencing builders is a really valid point. There's huge carbon trapped in conventional building materials, which we are aware of. I think Aylsham resides under Broadland Council. I wish it wasn't like this, but it is. But in North Norfolk, we're about to develop and issue a new plan for the district that will run up right up for the next 15 years, which outlines where we can build, what types of building. In that plan, we think we've got one of the greenest plans in the country, in actual fact. Our officers have alluded to that with me. And so I think you can pressurise Broadland Council to really tighten up on building control. That's the type of heating that is being stipulated. All homes, in my view, should have some form of renewable energy creation, maybe EVCPs, high levels of insulation, all those sort of things. Get them into your local plan so that we force developers to do this. Rob, can you remind me what the second part of the question was?
Yes, it's about the resources needed to sort of back up this declaration. You know, how much has it, not in terms of pounds, but you know, how much does it take, and how, you know, where does it sit in the council's priorities? Obviously, emptying bins on time and those kinds of things are always going to be a key priority for a district council. But you know, how do we resource something like this, which is, you know, is now kind of trumping everything in terms of importance?
Indeed, and it is a challenge. Many of the, what I would say, low-hanging fruit projects, like the, you know, generating renewable energy, actually over a period of time pay for themselves. Most of them, those sort of schemes, give savings from day one off the council's core costs, and most in a few years are actually revenue making in their own right. So some of these schemes will pay for themselves. Others, like insulating our buildings and our estates, the same thing applies. So whilst there's an upfront capital expenditure, most of these schemes actually come back and save residents money, because it's basically residents' money, not ours. These are schemes that will ultimately save us money, but not underestimating the sums of money involved. I would like to see more help from the government with this. There's a few schemes that are kicking off. The public sector scheme to improve council facilities. You have to bid for that. It's not given to you. You're in competition with other councils. And sadly, I suspect there'll be some politics involved in who gets those awards made to them. But it doesn't stop us from applying, and we'll continue to do that. The carbon action strategy that we'll soon be producing and publishing will give some indication as to the level of costs that will be required to get us down to carbon zero. And then it's up to us, people like politicians like myself, to make sure that money becomes available.
Thank you. Yes. So yeah, it's a brave step. It's a brave step to make a declaration, but it's important to follow it through and to give it the due level of resource. So yeah, that's part of the first question, I suppose, about how difficult is it. We've got a question now, which I'd like to pose to Annie, which is about carbon offsetting. And you know, there's a general view. So invited here, and I'll ask the other panelists to come forward as well. But you know, what is the role of carbon offsetting and what, as a council, do you anticipate us doing in that respect?
Thanks, Rob. Yes, I mean, I touched a little bit on this one in my presentation, but obviously, and I think the video that we showed talked a little bit about how, as an organisation, you sort of decarbonise as much as possible. So you deliver, things like solar panels on your buildings, ground source, air source heat pumps. But even once you've done that, you're still left with some residual carbon emissions, which you then need to offset. And I suppose it's worth local authorities thinking now about how they are going to offset any of their remaining carbon emissions, so that they can meet that 2030 target. And I suppose, what we would like to see at North Norfolk, and something that I'm personally as well really passionate about, is about delivering offsetting solutions through sort of ecosystem services, or through natural systems such as tree planting. And so for me, I think that there's an exciting opportunity to either work with landowners or to work with the third sector. So there's obviously lots of charities in North Norfolk who are sort of environmental based. So to work with them in partnership to lead on carbon sequestration schemes, and that's something I think is really exciting, because not only does it deliver biodiversity kind of gains, you kind of meet your targets in terms of sequestering carbon, and therefore meeting your net zero target. But it also, there's an opportunity to sort of, I suppose, deliver something that everybody gets to feel the benefit of. If it's a site that has public access, it's something that I suppose just feels a little bit more tangible than some of the other things that councils do, and the other things that businesses do to decarbonise. So yeah, I think that's probably my answer. I don't know if Michael or
Thanks, Annie. So yeah, Michael. So what's the sort of scientific view of offsetting? Is it a last resort? Is it a cop out?
Yeah, I think the key thing with offsetting is you have to make sure that if you are implementing it, it has to be to close the gap. It can't be instead of doing something that might actually be possible. And so I think what Annie just mentioned then is around, once we've got the emissions reduction plan out to a certain level, whatever's left that genuinely can't be reduced, and we'll make sure that that is genuinely can't be reduced, that's when you might want to look at carbon offsetting and other means of closing the gap. I think the important thing there as well, and Annie's already touched on it, is around making sure, if possible, that carbon offsetting is local. So making sure that there is a local benefit to the local communities. We don't necessarily want to just be paying into a national carbon credit system whereby, you've offset your X amount, but the trees might be, somewhere halfway across the world. If you can bring that local benefit within the local region, I think that's the best way to do it. So yeah, they're my two key points: making sure that only do it if you have to, and also try and make it as local as possible.
Yeah, there's a lot talked about, to use the jargon, about multiple benefits now. That yeah, that's what we should be striving for. So they could be carbon offsetting, but they can also be providing services to the local community, or improving environmental conditions, etc. Nigel Cornwall, you've got your hand up, and if you'd like to sort of supplement what Michael said, or come up with another
yes, really.
thought.
I mean, first of all, simply to agree strongly with what Michael said. I mean, I've been active in this area of carbon mitigation for some while, and it is very clear that the prevailing wind is changing around offsetting. In its 6th carbon budget, the Climate Change Committee was really a lot more hawkish around just assuming that whatever's left can be dealt with by nature-based solution. There is a lot of debate around some of the global schemes in this area. And as Michael says, I think one of our key focuses within Net Zero East will be looking at regional solutions that capture these co-benefits. But they shouldn't be seen as an alternative to action. There are a couple of questions I saw earlier around this land use change and forestry, which is one of the 6 categories that government decomposes emissions into. It is clear that in many places, nature-based solutions are already providing offset benefits. That does not apply in, I think, virtually most of Norfolk because of the high incidence of peatlands. And it's a really big issue the further west you go into Kings Lynn and West Norfolk. We certainly have started promoting or accelerating our work in this area. Historically, we've also done work around trading systems which deal with not emissions as such, but compliance certificates that government wants to embed in the energy market. And we've got some early stage thinking on how this can be done. But I know, there are people like Felbeck Trust and Hookham on the call. We would be very keen to engage with them to understand how we can take their real world knowledge of what's happening on the ground in the field, as it were, combine it with our understanding of regulation and policy, and see if we can act as an advocate for a very different regional approach. And obviously, when we've had these high-level discussions in the past, Rob, North Norfolk have been keen to understand the debate. We need to now extend that into other districts and in both Norfolk and Suffolk, because I think there is a specific set of issues around these very high positive emissions from land use that we can actually utilise as a benefit if we can come up with the right solutions.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And we've had a supplementary question coming in, which is, can you give, this is a difficult one, and you can all put your thinking caps on. Can you give an example of an actual carbon offsetting project in North Norfolk? And, or if not one which is considered to be live at the moment, what opportunities are there? We've got a variety, we've got a varied landscape, we've got coastal areas, we've got a whole range of potential opportunities. So, what should we be looking towards for offsetting projects? Annie, is it putting you on the spot too much? But can you come up with an answer to that one?
Yeah, it's not in North Norfolk, but it's very close. There's the Wendling Beck project that's happening. I think it's just near Dereham, and we'll put a link to that in the chat bar. I don't know a huge amount about it, though we are actually planning to go and meet them on site in I think later on this month. So I'll just ask Nigel if you could just pop the details of Wendling Beck in the chat bar. The other thing which Nigel mentioned, so I'm not going to steal it, he actually mentioned it, he sat over there being very helpful, was the Norfolk Ponds projects as well. And so that's one way that you can sequester carbon through that sort of ecosystem service. So we'll just pop the details of that in the chat bar if that's useful.
Thank you very much. And there's an interesting discussion around this about what is offsetting, and I'm sure the science around that will change. We've got coastal habitats, and we've got salt marsh, which is considered to be a possibility of providing opportunities for offsetting, and also seaweed growth. So there could be some sort of marine related solutions which in North Norfolk could be applicable. Just scanning across the panel, anybody want to come up, anybody know of any other examples or want to come up with any examples? Sorry, Michael, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Rob, the last point you made around seaweed growth, I think that is already happening off the coast of Norfolk. I think Ethical Innovation is leading up some of that work. If I can find the link before the end of the call, I'll pop it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Annie's about to say we've got a presentation. She might have the details, and maybe we can put that in the chat as well. But we've got a presentation about that specific item, and that's another example of multiple benefits, isn't it? So you can provide, seaweed growth for commercial purposes to provide products which are, a low carbon product, but in doing so, you're also sequestering carbon in the process. So, Annie, did you want to say anything more about
that? Just to say that we've got a talk from the Ethical Innovation Centre about the what's called the Algae Innovation Platform. So we've got a speaker, I think tomorrow at 2 o'clock, who's going to be talking about that that industry and the potential that there is for it off the Norfolk coast and the East Anglian coast. So I'm just going to pop the details for that into the chat bar as well, if anyone's interested.
Thanks, Annie, and thanks, Michael. Yes, so we do have opportunities, and we are aware of things emerging. But here's a sort of not unrelated question. I'm going to pose it to Nigel Lloyd. First of all, it's very specific. Is North Norfolk District Council peat free? So there's been some lobbying, certainly over the weekend, with the National Trust and other organisations coming forward to lobby the government to try and encourage them to become peat free. Some of our problems that Michael's outlined from the past are peat extraction to create the Norfolk Broads, which itself is now a fantastic environmental habitat, but it results from peat extraction, which causes emissions. So is North Norfolk District Council peat free? Should we be? There's a supplementary question. And any other comments about the role of peat? Can I start with you, Nigel Lloyd?
Yes. The answer is yes. We are peat free. The current partner that we work with to look after our maintained gardens, that contract calls for zero use of peat products on North Norfolk District Council's land. And I think that's an important message. The downsides of using peat and digging peat, I won't go into now. I'm sure most of our listeners will understand that that's the case. And I'm also working to remove, we're very small users of glycophosphate weed killers too, and officers are currently working on, what will it mean for the council if we just stop using it completely, which is that's my desire to do that too on our maintained gardens. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and I suppose it's another example of not only what the council can do itself or does itself, but how we can influence our contractors and supply chain through procurement policies. To require them to be peat free, for example, as well. So people acting on our behalf, we would make sure that we've put in the relevant provisions in contracts for services to ensure the highest environmental standards that we would impose on ourselves. Any other comments about peat from anybody in the panel? Okay, well, we can sort of start to draw this to a close, but here's a general question relating to COP26, and it's been a 2-week conference, as you all know, and Greenbuild has been sort of working along that same time period. Last week was all about world leaders making declarations. So the question is, bearing in mind the commitments made by world leaders last week in Glasgow, how confident are you that this week realistic programs will be agreed by civil servants to put that rhetoric into action? So this is about our confidence about all that's been said and how that can become a reality. Can I start with you, Nigel Lloyd?
We've got another week to go. I'm slightly underwhelmed, if is my honest answer. That's a personal answer. It's not the position of the council. I just feel that they could have gone more. The Paris agreements were not really ratified across the world in the way they should have been. It's just too easy for these global politicians to make pledges and then go away and forget all about them. And I guess we'll have to wait and see, but we don't have that time to wait any longer. I just really hope that you know, they all go away and start doing what they promised at COP26. It was interesting to hear today that some of the largest group of attendees were hydrocarbon producers. I don't know, I can't verify that. I just heard it on the news this morning. It's rather disappointing. I hope they're not there to lobby government, but I suspect there's some of that going on as well. So yeah, I'm cautious. We should be coming back in 6 months or a year and see what's happened and tell the world what our political leaders have done. People like myself and other councils who have declared a climate emergency are actively getting on with it and making a difference. Let's see the governments of the day across the world do the same. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Nigel. Yeah, as a film that you'll have, that many people hear me mention time and again, which is called The Age of Stupid, which is set in the future, looking back on the decision makers of today, and saying, which is basically on the premise that, well, with all that you knew, why didn't you take the right decisions? You know, why did you let things carry on to the inevitable consequence? So that's yeah, let's hope that those actions, those declarations do turn into actions. Any other panel member want to make a comment on COP26 and the you know, the outcomes that we can expect? Maybe, you know, how does that filter down to the local authority level? Annie?
I suppose I won't comment too much on this, but first of all, 2070 targets are too late. We saw some of those last week, and I think one of the deforestation targets obviously was that the 100 leaders signed was for 2030 to stop deforestation. Well, deforestation needs to stop sooner than that. So I suppose they're kind of my very broad brush comments on COP so far. But I think the real momentum and the real action will come from people, from the public, and I think that there is a bit of a groundswell that's happening, and I suppose if anything, what COP26 has done is that it's starting to mainstream the agenda. It's in the news, people are talking about it, and that is massive, and it's really important. So, you know, I haven't got too many comments on what this week's going to lead to in terms of COP26 specifically, but I think that increased passion and interest and engagement with this agenda will continue, and I think that is really important. Well, obviously it's really important, but I think that will set into motion changes that perhaps the actual agreements might not set into motion, but we will see.
I saw Nigel Cornwall, you were indicating you had a response. Did you want to say something about COP26?
How long have you got? I'm not going to get drawn into the politics of it. Politics are always difficult. Even on the news this morning, Radio 4 News, I think Glasgow is about the 4th news item. So you compare that with where we were last Monday. I think, you know, Annie's absolutely right about the agenda being mainstreamed for many, but I think there's also a degree of citizen fatigue creeping in. So you've just got to get on and do what you can do. I guess I always default to the point where, you know, I love living in Norfolk, North Norfolk. It is one of the more vulnerable areas of the country. So I think that should bring some focus. There is an issue that we haven't really touched on yet. I know Michael referenced it earlier, the net zero strategy that appeared the week before COP26. I didn't find a huge amount in that, but kind of had me thinking, yeah, we're charging forward here. And I think there are some particular issues for district councils in places like Norfolk. The costs of abatement, well, first of all, there will be higher abatement costs, but also the cost of the conventional policy strategies are higher. And that just does not seem to have been thought about. So we need to get better balance and resourcing. But ultimately, it comes back to the point that was made earlier. We've just got to get on with this and use our imagination and creativity to show what good looks like. And, you know, if more of us do that than don't, we'll make more progress. So very pragmatic, but we've got to get on with it and let the political process run its course. It will never be perfect.
Thanks. So at North Norfolk, we'll be completing and publishing our action plan, which will demonstrate how we intend to get to net zero by 2030. You know, let's hope that we can share that with local people. We can use that to inspire local organisations and perhaps encourage other councils to follow suit. But you're absolutely right, Nigel, that actually this council and this area in North Norfolk is at the forefront of climate change in terms of the impacts of it. Adaptation is also vital. So I'll give a plug to an event which is taking place as part of this Greenbuild series tomorrow, which is talking about coastal communities, our economy, society, and how we respond to a changing climate, with some interesting talks about you know, coastal adaptation, for example. And on a note of optimism, if I can give another plug to Dr. Ella Gilbert, who's going to give a talk on climate optimism on the 11th of November at 2 p.m. So we've got, there's plenty of opportunities for people who maybe haven't had their questions today answered, but to maybe join in some of those further sessions and you know, continue the discussion about how we can take those global messages and apply them locally. So open to the panel now, before I just give you a sort of final thanks and let you off the hook. If you were going to identify one thing that North Norfolk District Council should do, what would it be? I'll start with Annie. What can we do more of, or maybe what should we stop doing?
Okay. Well, that's a big question, isn't it?
It's a big question.
It's like having a job interview. So I suppose for me, it goes. I know I've said it before, so I sound a bit like a broken record, but it is about. You know, I've talked about it being a passion of mine. It's about how we try and look at when we do need to offset, how we do that locally, and how we can tie in that range of benefits so that the agenda is obvious to people. They can see that what the council is doing to decarbonise, and that carbon sequestration is obviously a part of that. But also, you know, my background's in green infrastructure and woodlands and woodland management, so it's a passion of mine. So I would like to see the enhancement of biodiversity being increased in our agenda, and that one route through that is through delivering carbon sequestration projects. There you go.
Great. No, thank you. Yeah, so making it relevant and beneficial to local communities, and they can recognise what needs to be done and what the importance of doing that. Great. And Michael, what advice would you give us as a council?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'd also say at the end of what Annie's just said, that's something that is forgotten about a lot in the net zero debate, is the whole biodiversity angle, and I think it is important that we try and bring that in where we can. So I agree with Annie on that point. I suppose I try and go for a capture-all approach, and I'd say the thing that NNDC can be doing is leading by example. So doing whatever you can to set the example for other businesses and other communities and show that, you know, this is how we can do things. And there was a point I made in my presentation around actually proving viability of decarbonisation, because at the moment it is all talk, and a lot of other local authorities and other businesses are committing to net zero, but we haven't seen it achieved yet in a legit way that doesn't involve pure carbon offsetting. So I suppose what the council can do is show that, you know, net zero is possible, and we're going to go about delivering that, and we're going to update you on that as we go along. And so if the council can get to a point by 2030 whereby it's reached net zero and it's proved that it can do it within a rural district like North Norfolk that experiences all of the constraints it does experience, like no gas grid access and electricity grid constraints, issues with getting new generation online. If you can do it with all of that in that context, I think it's possible anywhere. So that's hopefully a strand of optimism that we can leave this with, even if COP26 isn't what we wanted it to be. Hopefully we can do something at the local level that's moving us all forward.
That's great, thank you. So coming finally to you, Councillor Nigel Lloyd. This is your portfolio, so maybe this is your chance to to share with us what do you think we really could be doing.
No pressure, Rob. Eh? My answer is going to be quite simple, actually. The existential problem that we're all facing at the moment is too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and too much greenhouse gases. So my priority is to drive those down, those that we can influence at North Norfolk District Council, that of our own direct, all three scopes, scope 1, 2 and 3, we need to get down to carbon zero. And if we can do that, you know, we've achieved our target. And by so doing, as Michael alluded to just now, we're setting an example for others and other councils, other people live in, you know, homes and businesses across the district, and say that this is possible. We can do it, despite the prevarications of global and national politicians. This corner of Great Britain has managed to drive its emissions down. I think that's achievable. I think we'll do it. We've got a great team around us. Yeah, and let's be positive. Let's end on a positive note. I think this is doable. So yeah, that's my overall priority about all this, is getting our carbon footprint down.
That's great, thank you for that, and that's a really positive note to end on. You know, we're doing it. We can work together and do it, achieve those local benefits. So it just leaves me to thank our two presenters, Annie and Michael, and the panelists, including Councillor Nigel Lloyd and Nigel Cornwall. So a virtual big round of applause to you. Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you for posting questions and for your comments in the chat. And you know, please look out for further events, and certainly for the Greenbuild event, which will be happening in the autumn next year, possibly as a real event as well as online. And our Environment Forum will be continuing throughout the year, and we'll encourage people to get in touch with us and to join in the discussion and help us to reach the goals that we've announced. So that's all of it for today. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us. A big virtual round of applause, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you.